The night was darker than usual as the Secret Service paranormal investigation team approached Bellamy Bridge. Commander Jack Harper peered through the windshield of their van, the headlights barely cutting through the thick fog that clung to the twisted branches of the trees like a living thing. The bridge itself was barely visible, just a ghostly silhouette looming in the distance, half swallowed by the mist. Bellamy Bridge had a reputation that preceded it. For centuries, the locals had whispered about the bridge's cursed history: disappearances, blood sacrifices, and strange creatures that stalked the woods. But the most chilling stories came from recent years. Hikers vanished without a trace, their bodies never found. The government had hushed up the incidents, sending in Harper's team to quietly investigate. Their mission was simple: confirm whether the stories of supernatural activity were true, and if so, neutralize it. "Everyone ready?" Harper asked, his voice a low growl. His team, a motley crew of hardened veterans and tech specialists, nodded in unison. They weren't new to paranormal investigations, but the atmosphere around Bellamy Bridge felt different. Heavy, oppressive. Even the air seemed to vibrate with something unseen, lurking just beyond the veil of reality. The team set up base a few hundred yards from the bridge, each member equipped with the latest ghost hunting gear: thermal cameras, EMF meters, and motion sensors. All of it was military grade, but Harper knew that no amount of technology could truly prepare them for what lay ahead. As they began their sweep of the area, Harper felt a strange sensation creeping up his spine. He turned, half expecting to see something in the fog, but there was nothing, just the suffocating mist and the eerie quiet of the forest. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the woods. The team froze, weapons drawn. Out of the corner of his eye, Harper saw something move, fast, too fast for a human. A dark figure darted between the trees, disappearing into the fog. "What the hell was that?" whispered Davis, the youngest member of the team, his voice trembling. "Stay sharp," Harper ordered, his grip tightening on his gun. "It's just starting." As they moved closer to the bridge, the fog thickened, becoming almost impenetrable. Visibility dropped to near zero. The air grew colder, and Harper's breath formed clouds in front of him. The bridge came into view, a rotting skeleton of wood and iron that creaked ominously in the stillness. They crossed the threshold, and instantly, the atmosphere shifted. The oppressive weight in the air intensified, pressing down on their chests. The motion sensors began to beep, and the EMF meters spiked erratically. "Commander, you might want to see this," called out Liz, the team's tech specialist. Harper moved to her side, his heart pounding as he looked at the thermal camera. There, in the distance, barely visible through the fog, was a cluster of figures, human-shaped but twisted. Their bodies were contorted in unnatural angles, like broken dolls, and they flickered in and out of existence, as if they were caught between worlds. "What are those things?" Harper asked, his voice low. "Crawlers," Liz whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "They're watching us." Before Harper could react, the figures began to move, fast, impossibly fast. They darted toward the team, their limbs bending and snapping as they closed the distance. "Fall back, now!" Harper shouted, but it was too late. The first crawler lunged from the shadows, its skin pale and translucent, its eyes glowing with a sickly yellow light. It slammed into Davis, dragging him into the fog with a blood-curdling scream. The team opened fire, but their bullets seemed to have little effect. The crawlers were too fast, too strong. One by one, they began to vanish into the mist, their screams fading as the creatures dragged them into the unknown. Harper stood frozen for a moment, staring into the fog where his team had disappeared. And then he realized Bellamy Bridge wasn't just haunted. It was alive, and it wanted them dead. Harper stumbled back toward the remnants of his team, heart racing. The thick fog around Bellamy Bridge seemed to pulse, drawing closer, as if the very air itself was hunting them. Liz, pale and shaking, stood beside him, her fingers clutching the thermal camera like a lifeline. Her face was ghostly white, and Harper could tell that whatever she had seen through the lens had shaken her to the core. "We need to go back for Davis," Liz stammered, her voice barely audible. "No," Harper snapped, his voice laced with grim resolve. "He's gone. Before Liz could protest, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed from the direction of the bridge. The sound was slow, deliberate, as if someone or something was walking toward them. The team readied their weapons, eyes darting in every direction, but the fog was too thick to see anything clearly. A figure emerged from the mist, walking with a strange, mechanical gait. At first, Harper thought it was Davis, but as the figure drew closer, his blood ran cold. It wasn't Davis. It was something far worse. The figure's face was contorted in an expression of pure agony. Its skin stretched tight over its skull, eyes sunken deep into its head. Its body was twisted and broken, limbs bent at impossible angles. It wore a tattered uniform, the same as the team's, but the thing before them was no longer human. "Davis," Liz whispered, her voice trembling. The creature didn't respond. Instead, it raised its arm, jagged, skeletal fingers pointing directly at Harper. A low, guttural growl rumbled from its throat, sending chills down Harper's spine. "Open fire," Harper ordered, but the bullets seemed to pass right through the creature. It lunged, moving faster than any human should be able to, and Harper barely had time to dive out of the way. Liz screamed as the creature wrapped its bony fingers around her throat, lifting her off the ground with terrifying ease. "Liz!" Harper shouted, rushing forward to pull her free, but it was no use. The creature tightened its grip, and with a sickening snap, Liz's body went limp. The fog thickened around them, swallowing the scene. Harper could hear the whispers now, faint voices drifting through the mist, calling out his name, beckoning him to come closer. The bridge itself groaned, as though it were alive, reacting to the carnage that had unfolded at its base. Harper staggered backward, his mind racing. The stories were true. Bellamy Bridge wasn't just cursed. It was a gateway to something far worse, something ancient and malevolent. And it wanted blood. Harper's lungs burned as he sprinted through the woods, his boots slapping against the soggy earth. The fog seemed to thicken the farther he ran from the bridge, but no matter how far he went, the air hummed with an unnatural energy. The echo of Liz's final scream haunted him, reverberating through the mist like a ghostly chorus. Davis was gone, Liz too. They were being hunted, and he didn't know by what. He slowed, chest heaving, when he reached the temporary command post. The remaining team members, Shields and Ortiz, looked at him with wide, questioning eyes. Their faces, illuminated by the glow of computer monitors and ghost hunting equipment, betrayed their growing fear. "Where's the rest of the team?" Shields asked, his voice shaky. "Gone," Harper managed between breaths. "We lost them at the bridge. Crawlers." At the mention of the creatures, Ortiz paled, his hands trembling over the motion sensors. "We're not alone here," Ortiz muttered, eyes darting nervously around the perimeter. "They've been following us. I've seen them, Commander, moving through the trees. They're not just at the bridge. They're everywhere." Shields, a skeptical ex-Marine, furrowed his brow and gripped his rifle tighter. "This is bullshit, Commander. We should call for backup, get a chopper or something." Before Harper could respond, a loud crash echoed through the forest, followed by the unmistakable sound of branches snapping under heavy footsteps. The fog rippled as though something massive was moving through it, something unseen. Shields raised his gun, aiming into the mist. "What the hell is that?" The EMF meters began to spike, lights flashing erratically. Ortiz's screen flickered to life, showing an image distorted with static. He frantically tried to adjust the settings, but the interference was overwhelming. The readings weren't just paranormal anymore. Something far worse had joined them. A guttural growl echoed from the fog, low and rumbling, like a predator stalking its prey. Harper's eyes scanned the tree-line, every instinct in his body screaming that whatever was out there, it wasn't human. "We need to move. Now," Harper ordered. As they packed up the equipment, the temperature around them plummeted. Frost formed on the leaves and the ground beneath their feet. Shields cursed under his breath, his rifle shaking in his hands. Then it happened. The trees ahead bent unnaturally, twisting like they were being bent by invisible hands. Something moved through the fog, but they couldn't see it, not fully. A shadow passed between the trees, too large, too silent. Suddenly, a shriek tore through the silence. A sound so piercing and inhuman that it sent a shockwave of fear through the team. Shields fired blindly into the fog, bullets ricocheting off trees. "Get back!" Harper shouted, yanking him away. But it was too late. Something massive and invisible slammed into Shields, knocking him off his feet. He hit the ground hard, screaming as unseen claws raked across his chest, tearing through his vest like paper. Harper and Ortiz could only watch in horror as Shields was dragged into the fog, his screams growing distant, fainter, until there was nothing but the quiet hum of the forest. "We can't fight this," Ortiz stammered, tears welling in his eyes. "We need to get out of here. We need—" A low, breathy whisper interrupted him, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. "Run!" Harper's blood ran cold. He knew that voice. It was Liz's, but twisted, distorted. It wasn't her anymore. Without another word, Harper grabbed Ortiz's arm, dragging him toward the woods. The fog pressed in closer, the unseen growl echoing all around them as they disappeared deeper into the night. The night grew darker as Harper and Ortiz stumbled through the dense forest, the twisted trees looming like silent sentinels. The path before them seemed endless, each step pulling them deeper into the heart of Bellamy's curse. The fog didn't let up, clinging to them like a suffocating blanket, cutting off any sense of direction. "Where the hell are we going?" Ortiz panted, glancing nervously over his shoulder. His breathing was ragged, panic threatening to overtake him. "Just keep moving," Harper growled, scanning the tree-line for movement. He could feel it. Something was still out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. As they forged ahead, a faint light appeared in the distance. Harper motioned for Ortiz to follow him toward the source. They approached cautiously, weapons drawn, and found a small clearing. In the center stood an old, dilapidated cabin, barely standing amidst the overgrowth. The windows were shattered, and the door hung crooked on its hinges, creaking softly in the wind. "We can take shelter here for now," Harper said, eyeing the structure warily. Ortiz hesitated, but with nowhere else to go, he nodded. They stepped inside, the wooden floorboards groaning under their weight. The interior was worse than the outside. The walls were covered in strange symbols, carved deep into the wood, and the air reeked of rot. "Commander, what is this place?" Ortiz whispered, his voice barely audible. Harper didn't answer. His eyes were drawn to a large, cracked mirror hanging on the far wall. It was the only thing in the cabin that didn't look centuries old. Something about it unsettled him, like it didn't belong there. Suddenly, the air in the room grew colder. The breath in Harper's lungs turned to mist, and the fog outside began to seep through the cracks in the walls, filling the room. The symbols on the walls started to glow faintly, pulsing with an otherworldly light. Then the whispers started. At first, they were faint, like distant voices carried on the wind. But they grew louder, more distinct. Harper and Ortiz looked at each other, fear in their eyes. The whispers were coming from the mirror. Slowly, almost unwillingly, Harper turned to face the cracked glass. His reflection stared back at him, but something was wrong. His reflection was smiling, a wide, twisted grin that stretched too far across its face. "Commander, do you see that?" Ortiz asked, his voice barely a whisper. Before Harper could answer, the reflection in the mirror moved, independently of them. It stepped forward, closer to the glass, its grin widening. Then, in a voice that wasn't his own, it spoke. "Welcome back, Jack." The mirror shattered, sending shards of glass flying across the room. The air became electric, buzzing with energy as the cabin shook violently. Harper grabbed Ortiz, dragging him toward the door as the ground beneath them cracked open. The last thing they heard before they bolted from the cabin was the laughter, low, deep, and inhuman, echoing from the shattered remains of the mirror. Harper and Ortiz raced through the forest, the shattered cabin and demonic laughter fading behind them, though the sense of dread only grew. The deeper they ran into the woods, the more the world around them seemed to distort. Trees appeared to twist in unnatural directions, their branches curling like skeletal fingers reaching out for them. The fog grew thicker, as if alive, swirling in eerie patterns that seemed almost deliberate. Harper stopped to catch his breath, his hands trembling as he tightened his grip on his weapon. Ortiz collapsed beside him, panting heavily, his face pale with fear. "We can't keep running like this," Ortiz wheezed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever's out there, it's not human. We're outmatched." "I know," Harper muttered, scanning the trees. "But we're not sticking around to find out what else it can do." Suddenly, the air grew unnervingly still. The oppressive silence was shattered by a distant sound, a soft, rhythmic thumping, like the slow beat of a giant heart. Harper's eyes darted in the direction of the sound, his instincts screaming danger. "Do you hear that?" Ortiz whispered, his voice trembling. Harper nodded, his pulse quickening. The sound was growing louder, coming closer, and then it stopped. In the distance, a shadow moved. It was quick, too fast to identify, but it was large, much larger than any human could be. Harper motioned for Ortiz to follow him as they crept forward, trying to stay hidden within the thick undergrowth. As they approached the edge of a small clearing, they froze in their tracks. In the middle of the clearing stood Davis. He was standing perfectly still, his back to them, his head cocked at a strange angle, as if listening to something only he could hear. His clothes were torn, and blood dripped from several gashes on his arms and neck, but he seemed oblivious to the injuries. "Davis!" Harper called out cautiously, his voice low but firm. Davis didn't respond. He didn't move. "Davis!" Harper shouted, louder this time, but there was no reaction. Ortiz started to step forward, but Harper held him back. Something wasn't right. The way Davis was standing, it was too rigid, too unnatural. Without warning, Davis's head snapped around, and Harper's breath caught in his throat. His eyes were hollow, empty pits of darkness, and his mouth twisted into an unnatural grin that spread too wide, stretching the skin of his face taut. "Commander!" Ortiz whimpered, backing away. Davis took a step toward them, the grin never faltering. His movements were jerky, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. "He's not Davis anymore," Harper muttered, raising his weapon. "Whatever's controlling him, it's not human." Suddenly, Davis lunged, moving faster than any human should be able to. Harper fired a shot, but it passed through Davis as though he were made of mist. Ortiz screamed and stumbled back, tripping over a root and crashing to the ground. Davis stopped abruptly, his body twitching unnaturally before collapsing to the ground like a rag doll. His eyes remained open, that horrifying grin still etched on his face. Ortiz scrambled to his feet, shaking violently. What the hell is happening? Harper didn't have an answer. The air around them buzzed with energy, and that strange heartbeat sound returned, louder now, vibrating through the ground. "We need to get out of here," Harper said, his voice barely a whisper. But as they turned to flee, the fog thickened, solidifying into something almost tangible, trapping them in the clearing. Shadows moved within the mist, too many to count, their shapes shifting from human to something far more grotesque. Twisted creatures with too many limbs and eyes that gleamed in the darkness. "Run!" Harper shouted, but it was too late. Harper and Ortiz sprinted through the forest, the fog growing denser with each step, closing in around them like a tightening noose. The shadowy figures moved within the mist, their grotesque forms barely visible but unmistakably monstrous. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent chills down their spines. The forest itself felt alive, an ancient, malevolent force determined to consume them. Suddenly, a piercing scream echoed through the fog, cutting through the night like a knife. Harper's heart pounded in his chest as he turned to Ortiz. "That scream, it's Liz. But she's dead." Ortiz finished, his voice shaking. "Or maybe she's not. Maybe something has her." Harper didn't want to think about what that meant. Liz's death had been brutal, her body torn apart by the crawlers. But the sound of her scream was unmistakable, and it seemed to be coming from deeper within the fog. "We can't go back," Harper muttered, his mind racing. "We need to keep moving." But the fog wasn't giving them a choice. It swirled and pulsed, thickening ahead of them, forcing them in the direction of the scream. Harper tightened his grip on his weapon, every instinct in his body screaming that they were walking into a trap. Yet there was no other option. As they pressed forward, the temperature dropped, and the ground beneath their feet turned soft and swamp-like, sucking at their boots. The mist parted briefly, revealing a figure standing motionless in the distance. Harper's stomach churned as he recognized her immediately, Liz. But she wasn't right. Her body was whole, not mangled like when they had found her. Her skin was pale, and her eyes were vacant, staring off into the distance. She stood with unnatural stillness, like a puppet waiting for its strings to be pulled. "Liz," Ortiz whispered, his voice cracking with a mix of hope and terror. She didn't respond, but slowly, her head turned to face them, her eyes locking onto Harper. A chill ran down his spine as her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, too wide for her face. The air buzzed with energy, and Harper could feel the presence of something ancient and evil surrounding them. "Run," Liz whispered, her voice distorted, echoing through the mist. "Run before they take you too." Before Harper could react, the ground beneath them erupted. Massive hands, skeletal and covered in rotting flesh, burst from the earth, grasping at their legs. Ortiz screamed, firing his weapon wildly as he was dragged into the muck. "Harper, help me!" Ortiz's voice was desperate, filled with terror. Harper reached out, grabbing Ortiz's arm, but the hands were relentless, pulling him deeper into the swampy earth. The fog swirled violently, and shadows closed in, their twisted forms becoming more defined. Creatures of pure nightmare, with too many eyes and mouths that whispered promises of death. As Ortiz was dragged under, Harper could do nothing but watch, helpless, as the fog swallowed his teammate whole. Harper stumbled through the fog, heart pounding, the thick, oppressive mist clinging to his skin like ice. Ortiz's screams still echoed in his ears, but they were getting fainter as the fog swallowed everything. His team, his sanity. Harper was alone, and the cursed Bellamy Bridge loomed ahead. The bridge wasn't what he expected. It was old, ancient even, rusted iron and weathered wood, sagging over the river below. The air crackled with energy, the kind that made his skin crawl and his stomach twist in knots. Shadows flickered in the fog, and every so often, he caught a glimpse of movement just out of the corner of his eye, something watching him. He reached the bridge's edge, but stopped short as the ground under his feet trembled. The fog thickened, swirling violently around the bridge like a storm ready to break. And then, through the mist, he saw her. A woman stood in the center of the bridge, her figure barely visible through the shifting fog. Her dress was tattered, drenched in blood, her face pale and gaunt. She wasn't moving, just staring into the abyss of the river below. But there was something so deeply wrong about her that it made his stomach lurch. "Liz," Harper whispered, though he knew it wasn't her. No, this was something far darker. This was Bellamy Bridge's curse made flesh. Without warning, her head snapped around, her eyes locking onto Harper. They were black, soulless pits, and her mouth twisted into a horrible, too-wide smile. Her voice was soft, but it echoed in his skull, filling his mind with dread. "They're coming for you, Harper," she said. "They'll take you, just like the others." He tried to back away, but the ground beneath him seemed to shift and buckle, rooting him to the spot. The shadows in the fog were closing in, and he could feel them breathing, low, guttural sounds that sent shivers down his spine. What are you?" he gasped, his throat dry, heart hammering in his chest. "I'm what they made me," the woman whispered, stepping closer. Her feet didn't seem to touch the ground, and her movements were wrong, jerky, like a puppet on invisible strings. "The curse is real, Harper. Bellamy Bridge hungers for blood. It always has." Harper's hand went to his gun, but deep down he knew it wouldn't help. Whatever this was, it wasn't something he could shoot. Suddenly, the fog behind him roared to life. The shadows in the mist surged forward, and Harper spun around just in time to see them. Crawlers, skinwalkers, monstrous things with too many limbs and eyes that gleamed with malevolence. They moved faster than any creature he'd ever seen, slithering and crawling over each other, mouths snapping and hissing. Panicked, Harper fired blindly into the fog, but the bullets did nothing. The creatures were upon him, their claws slicing through his flesh, tearing at his clothes. He felt his skin burn where they touched him, as if their very presence was poison. He screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the fog. His vision blurred, and the last thing he saw before darkness overtook him was the woman on the bridge, her smile growing wider and wider, her laughter echoing in his skull as the monsters dragged him into the mist. Harper awoke to darkness, absolute, suffocating darkness. His body ached, every muscle screaming in protest. But when he tried to move, he found he couldn't. He was bound, chained to something cold and metallic. The air was thick, rancid with the smell of rot, and a low, constant buzzing filled his ears. He blinked, struggling to adjust to the dim light. Slowly, his surroundings came into focus. He was in a large, cavernous space, the walls slick with moisture and covered in strange, pulsating growths. Shadows writhed along the edges of his vision, and the air crackled with an unnatural energy that made his skin crawl. And then he saw them, figures moving in the darkness. They were humanoid, but not human. Their limbs were too long, their bodies twisted and distorted. Crawlers, skinwalkers, the things that had dragged him from Bellamy Bridge. But now, in this place, they were somehow even more monstrous, their eyes glowing faintly in the gloom as they circled him like predators waiting to strike. Where am I?" Harper rasped, his voice barely audible over the buzzing in his ears. "You're in the heart of it," a voice replied from the shadows. It was deep, gravelly, and filled with malice. Slowly, a figure stepped into the faint light, revealing a man, or what had once been a man. His skin was pale and stretched tight over his bones, his eyes hollow and dead. He wore the tattered remains of a government-issued uniform, but there was nothing human left in his gaze. "The curse brought you here," the man said, his voice dripping with mockery. "You and your team thought you could stop it, but Bellamy Bridge always takes what it's owed." Harper's mind raced. He had heard the stories, the legends about Bellamy Bridge, and the people who had disappeared over the years. But this was something far worse than he had ever imagined. "What do you want from me?" Harper demanded, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and defiance. The man, if he could even be called that anymore, smiled, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. "We don't want anything from you. The bridge does. It feeds on fear, on blood, on souls. You were marked the moment you set foot on it." Harper struggled against the chains, but they held tight, digging into his skin. The creatures in the darkness moved closer, their breath hot and foul against his skin. "You can't escape," the man whispered, leaning in close. "No one ever does." And then, with a flick of his wrist, the chains holding Harper snapped. The creatures lunged at him, their claws digging into his flesh as they dragged him deeper into the abyss. The last thing Harper heard before the darkness consumed him was the sound of the bridge, creaking and groaning in the distance, hungry for more. Harper's body convulsed as he was dragged through the stinking, hellish abyss beneath Bellamy Bridge. He could feel the claws of the creatures tearing at his skin, the slick, cold floor beneath him coated with the blood of countless victims. His vision swirled between reality and nightmare, but one thing was clear: this was no longer the world he knew. He had crossed into something far more sinister, a domain where the bridge's curse thrived. Suddenly, the creatures stopped, their grotesque forms looming over him in the shadows. He gasped for breath, barely conscious, his body broken and bleeding. Above him, he could see the twisted silhouette of Bellamy Bridge, its rusted beams tangled like the ribs of a dying beast. The air buzzed with unnatural energy, a low, malevolent hum that made Harper's bones ache. And then, from the fog, they emerged, figures clad in dark cloaks, their faces obscured by hoods, only their eyes visible, glowing faintly with an eerie light. They were chanting, words that Harper couldn't understand, but the rhythm of their voices sent chills down his spine. "They are the keepers," a voice whispered from the darkness. Harper turned his head weakly, recognizing the gaunt, hollow-eyed man who had spoken before. "They guard the curse. They feed the bridge with the blood of the living." Harper's heart pounded as he realized what was happening. He was being offered up as a sacrifice, just like the countless others who had disappeared over the centuries. The cursed Bellamy Bridge wasn't just haunted, it was alive, and it demanded blood to sustain its power. With a surge of adrenaline, Harper tried to move, but his limbs were weak, barely responding. The cloaked figures approached, their chanting growing louder, their eyes glowing brighter. One of them pulled a long, curved blade from beneath their cloak, the metal glinting wickedly in the faint light. "No!" Harper rasped, his voice cracking. I won't die like this." The figure raised the blade high, and for a moment time seemed to freeze. Harper's mind raced, memories of his team, of Ortiz's screams, of everything they had gone through to get here. And now, here he was, at the mercy of this cursed place, about to be torn apart like the others. But then something shifted. The ground beneath him trembled, the air growing colder, sharper. The fog around them swirled violently, and the keepers hesitated, glancing around nervously. The hum in the air grew louder, almost deafening, and Harper could feel it deep in his bones. The bridge was angry. Before the blade could fall, the ground beneath the keepers cracked open with a thunderous roar, a black, swirling abyss tearing through the earth. The keepers screamed, their voices lost in the chaos as they were sucked into the darkness, their bodies vanishing into the void. The creatures that had held Harper backed away, their eyes wide with fear as the abyss spread, consuming everything in its path. Harper felt the pull of the void, but something held him back, something or someone. A faint, ethereal hand reached out, gripping his arm, pulling him away from the edge of the pit. As he looked up, he saw her again, the woman from the bridge, her face no longer twisted in malice but in sorrow. She was crying, her tears glowing faintly in the darkness. "You're not supposed to be here," she whispered, her voice filled with grief. "But neither was I." And with that, she vanished, leaving Harper lying on the edge of the abyss, the bridge's groans echoing in the distance. Harper lay motionless on the cold ground, his body aching, his mind reeling from the horror he had just witnessed. The bridge had spared him, why, he couldn't fathom, but it had taken everything else. The keepers, the creatures, even the fog had been consumed by the darkness. But it wasn't over. He could feel it in the air, the oppressive weight of the curse still lingering, waiting. Bellamy Bridge was not satisfied. With great effort, Harper pushed himself to his feet, his legs trembling beneath him. The wound on his side bled freely, but he had no time to care. He had to get away, had to escape this cursed place before it took him too. But as he turned toward the direction of safety, the ground beneath him shifted once more. From the darkness of the bridge, a figure emerged. It was no longer the gaunt man or the woman, but something far worse. A towering shadow, its form shifting and writhing like a living nightmare. Its eyes gleamed with an unnatural light, and its mouth split into a jagged, grotesque smile. Harper's breath caught in his throat as the shadow took a step forward, its voice a low, guttural growl that rattled his bones. "You cannot leave, Harper. You are bound to the bridge now, just as the others were." "I don't believe in your curse," Harper spat, trying to sound defiant, though his voice wavered. "I'll find a way out. You will die here, as they all have," the shadow interrupted, its laughter echoing through the night. "This is your end." The shadow lunged, its claws swiping through the air with blinding speed. Harper barely had time to react, stumbling back as the creature's claws grazed his side. Pain shot through him, but he ignored it, adrenaline surging through his veins as he ran as fast as his injured body would allow. The bridge groaned beneath his feet, the wood creaking and cracking as if it were alive, trying to trap him. But he kept running, his vision blurring as blood poured from his wounds. The shadow was close, its breath hot on his neck, its laughter ringing in his ears. But just as Harper reached the edge of the bridge, a blinding light erupted from the sky. The bridge trembled, the shadow recoiling with a shriek of rage. Harper shielded his eyes, feeling the heat of the light wash over him. And in that moment, he heard a voice, soft, gentle, but filled with power. "It's over," the voice said. "The bridge can claim no more." When Harper opened his eyes, the bridge was gone. The fog, the shadows, everything had vanished, leaving only the quiet, eerie stillness of the forest. He collapsed to the ground, his body finally giving out, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he felt safe. But even as darkness took him, Harper knew one thing for certain. The curse of Bellamy Bridge was far from over.